Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the 27 Virtual Podcast, where we share our experiences, our tips, our tricks from the field, and lessons learned, all surrounding our 27 Virtual capabilities with VMware. This time, we're talking with Bill Grismore, the co founder of 27 Virtual and director of consulting services, about high level design decisions with NSX-T. My name is Andrew Grismore, and we'll walk you through some of our thoughts together. So, how's it going today, Bill?
It's going awesome, Andrew. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we get into a lot of these conversations with our customers in the beginning of our engagements of, just scoping out what are you trying to accomplish with NSX-T and what makes the most sense for your environment. I know for you, it has a lot to do with how many sites they're dealing with, what services they want to take advantage of. So why don't you just walk us through some of your initial thoughts as you begin the architecting process of NSX?
Yeah, for sure. So definitely the very first thing I think about is how many sites do you have? And then what are you going to be using it for? So on an earlier podcast, we talked about why NSX networking, but there's really two components. There's networking and security. There's also some other services you can do from the edge. But the very first high level thing I would focus on is just how many sites you have. So if you break it down, if you have a single site, which some customers do, and I'm just backing up traditionally. If I have that single site, I have really three choices at that single site. I can do NSX just for networking, which is a great use case for that. I can do NSX just for security, probably the number one thing in today's climate with all the ransomware. I could do networking and security at that single site. And then the other thing would be the other services you can do at the edge, like you can do a VPN, you could do a load balancer. Those things are moved more into Avi now, but you can definitely take advantage of those three main things: networking, security, core edge services, and that can all be done on a single site or at a single site.
So, what about customers that are doing something like metro design? Do you count that as one site or multiple?
Right. So then the next thing would be, do you have two sites? To your point, metro, that's a really good one, by the way. It's a great question. So if I have two sites, the first question you would ask yourself is, what is the latency between those sites? And VMware defines it pretty clearly. The latency is something that's 10 milliseconds or less, or something between 10 and 150. So if you're 10 milliseconds or less, you can put yourself in a design where it's like it's a metro design. And now behind that, your vSphere environment would have to be in a stretch cluster and with stretch storage. And then there's particular designs we can do where it's a metro architecture, where we place edges, put an edge in one site that's active, put an edge in another site that's standby, and there's some magic that goes on there that makes that work. And you can basically treat the two data centers as one. A very common scenario would be like a college campus. A lot of college campuses or some businesses will have a campus environment where they actually have a data center in two different buildings, and they're far enough apart where they can still provide themselves resiliency from internet service provider or from an electrical grid provider status, but they're still within a metro. So you can really get a lot of high availability out of them. Depending on where that line is drawn from an electrical grid perspective, like we want to keep one half in a metro on one side from one provider's perspective and one half on the other, and that includes both internet service provider and electrical provider.
Gotcha. So now if we go full-blown multi-site, what do you start to think about?
Again, the first thing I'm going to look at is that latency between the sites. So if the latency is greater than 10, and if we get into the whole thing about whether it's 8 or 9 or 10, if customers can't guarantee that 10, that between 7 and 8 or so, if it ever goes above 10, then you're going to immediately go into more of a multi-site design. We're not really metro anymore. So be careful with metro if you're on the threshold. Metro customers were looking more really for 5 milliseconds and something that may peak to 8 or 9. If you're running at 8 or 9 and you have situations where you go to 15, then that's definitely going to push you more into a multi-site scenario, even if you sit in the same metro area or the same campus. So be careful with that. But if I'm looking at anything between 10 milliseconds and 150, I go to multi-site. And basically what that means is I have 2 data centers or 3 or 4, whatever it may be. And by definition, quote unquote, multi-site in an NSX environment means you're going to have one set of NSX-T managers at one of the sites. I have a separate vCenter at both sites, but just one set of NSX managers, but I can prep the entire environment as one NSX stretched network, one NSX security environment. So that means that it's stretched. I can stretch the network. I can provide all the networking security enhancements that NSX brings. It is multi-site, but if I ever lose a primary site, I have to take my management plane, I have to back it up to the other site, and then be able to recover those managers at that secondary site.
Gotcha. So definitely some things to think about as far as the management plane goes, but what about workload mobility?
Well, if I'm multi-site, the great thing about multi-site is it's really, really easy to set up. So there are some challenges with the DR scenario with the multi-site, which are very well documented, and you can overcome those challenges with proper steps and procedures. But the great thing about it is it's easy, and I can stretch the network between the sites. To your point, I can very easily now take a workload that lives at one site, and I can proactively, again, if there's like a hurricane coming, or let's say I want to do a full maintenance of my data center. Sometimes companies want to shift all the workloads from one data center to another data center. You can do that with this. So I could actually say, okay, we need to do X, Y, and Z in our original data center. Let's temporarily, proactively migrate the workloads over to data center B and do our maintenance on that primary data center. Almost kind of like what you do with maintenance mode on a host, but like maintenance mode on a data center. If you can imagine, doing something like that. So that's huge.
Yep. And then I guess the last thing I would ask you about this from a high level is a lot of people get hung up on this idea of active active. What does active active mean to you in NSX, and how do you visualize that in the beginning of the architecture process?
Don't do it. No, I'm just kidding.
And I'm talking multi-site active active, not like active active ECMP from the edge.
Yeah, active active means a lot of different things to different people. So let's first qualify what active active means. So at the very first level, if I'm in a single site and I have 2 NSX-T edges to do your north-south routing, I can configure those 2 edges to be active active, right? And that's not what you're asking about, right? At the other data center, I can have another set of edges that are also active active. If we go to this new federation, which we have another podcast on, what I can do is I can have 2 edges at one site that are active, both active, 2 edges at the other site that are both active. And then from a federation perspective, what I can do is make one of those sites primary and one of those sites secondary. That would mean that all my traffic, no matter where the workload sits, no matter what site it's in, my traffic is going to egress out of that primary site. If I try to make both sites active, you can do that, but you have to make sure you understand that the networks behind those active edges at both sites, if both sites are primary, or what they call in federation, all primary, then I have to think about how that's going to affect my routing. Because now I have routes behind both sets of edges that are being propagated north, and I got to have something in place with a route preference or a route map or something, or maybe a /32 route. I mean, it can get kind of complicated. So you can definitely do active active, but you got to remember, if traffic leaves one site and there's a firewall and it goes out and then it comes back in and it finds a route into the other site through the other firewall, if those firewalls aren't synced, it's going to drop the traffic. So there's a lot of considerations around doing active active at 2 sites. Now, there's one more thing I want to add to that. There's also applications that are like active active natively that you can actually deploy those outside of NSX, just on a regular VLAN port group. Like Active Directory is a really good example. So you got to think about active-active from these different levels. Think about it from an application level. If the application supports active-active, it probably doesn't even need to be on an NSX network. Infrastructure services like AD and DNS and DHCP that are all AD integrated type services, Active Directory understands multi-site natively, even though one site's on one IP address or one network and the other site's on another, it knows how to handle that, right? And then there's active-active from an edge standpoint. If I have a single site, I can have active-active edges. And then the third one would be having, with NSX, having two sites that are both active. So that kind of covers all the active-active scenarios.
Yeah. I mean, it's all things that you need to look at and plan for in the initial process, and just make sure you check off the checkbox to accomplish what the customer is looking for out of the overall solution. So there you
Yeah,
have it, everybody. Some initial high-level design thoughts from an NSX architect who's been doing it from the beginning. So thanks, Bill, as always, and we'll catch you guys on the next one.
sounds great. Thanks, Andrew.